I'm Jeff Lippman. I'm president of SunX Malta, and I'm the moderator on this ETC SunX course on climate-friendly travel. Now I'd like to ask my friend, Dr. Eduardo Santander, Executive Director of ETC, to make some opening remarks.
Dear ETC members, I am delighted together with colleagues from SunX Malta to welcome you today to our online climate-friendly travel training course. It is exciting to see so many of you participating. We hope that this 5-day course will be useful to complement your work in developing and implementing sustainability and climate plans for your destinations. Addressing the impact of tourism on climate change and supporting our member NTOs on the path to green transition is one of our key priorities of ETC's work. We aim to keep European tourism at the forefront of global climate action and step up our commitment towards decarbonization. The world is undoubtedly changing, so we also need to change in order to remain relevant, effective, and credible. We must adapt our license to operate in order to reflect the climate crisis. For those who don't know yet, I am happy to inform you that ETC is now the official signatory of the Glasgow Declaration. We fully support this declaration, which aims to cut tourism emissions at least in half over the next decade and reach net zero emissions as soon as possible before 2050. This is a very important step for ETC, and we are starting now the work to prepare the ETC Climate Action Plan to submit in the next 12 months. We first and foremost will examine our own actions and commit to making the necessary changes. This will affect the way our office operates, how we run our marketing campaigns promoting Europe, and the focus of our research activities. But we cannot decarbonize the European tourism sector on our own. ETC counts on our member NTOs, industry partners, and policymakers to join the battle and help us keep Europe the wonderful place it is to live and to travel. Allow me to share a few thoughts from our side setting up the scene for the course launch today. We all know that climate change is happening. It may seem remote to some of us, but in many of the world's tourist destinations, including parts of Europe, it is now a daily or annual reality. Tourism is both at risk for climate change and one of its causes. Even before COVID-19, we already saw that the traditional model of tourism, that is the way the sector has developed in Europe over the past 50 years, is at a tipping point. Economic and employment benefits had given way to an increased understanding of the costs that accompany tourism growth. We've seen that in some heavily visited destinations and areas, even local communities were actively discouraging tourism, and the impact on the environment was being felt. Now, as the sector finally recovers, we are seeing a stronger than expected bounce back. Travelers are eager to make up for 2 years of lost travel opportunities. This brings back the challenge that we were facing pre-COVID, with headlines showcasing the packed streets of Venice and Barcelona, for instance. At the same time, the sector is facing other major risks to restart: high inflation increasing the cost of living, massive staff shortages disrupting connectivity, and the prolonged war in Ukraine affecting destinations dependent on the Russian market and throwing a shadow on the image of Europe as a safe tourism destination. So the question remains, how can we mobilize destinations and tourism business communities to focus on climate change action at a time of this competing crisis? How can we make it easy and affordable as possible for tourism business to engage in decarbonization? We have already touched upon this question with some of you at our industry forum and general meeting in Ljubljana this May. And now it's time to dive deeper into a practical approach, learning more about exciting schemes and regulations, and of course, looking for solutions. So I wish you a very productive work in the next few days, so each of you can become a strong climate champion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to be together for 5 days, for 2 hours each day. 90 minutes of curated video, followed by 30 minutes of discussion, including with some of our guest lecturers. We use video just because there's so much good stuff out there. You can either listen to Jeffrey Lippman and hopefully learn a little, or you can listen to Jeffrey Sachs, advisor to the UN Secretary General, and learn a lot. And here's an example.
I'm Jeffrey Sachs. I'm a university professor at Columbia University and a senior advisor at the United Nations on the Sustainable Development Goals. I am deeply troubled and concerned. We're living in a period of incredible disasters, hurricanes, floods, droughts hitting the world. My God, what are we doing? This is really dangerous. People need to understand this. There's going to be worse to come in the future, even if we get everything under control, because we have a process that is gradually going to warm the planet for some decades now. And as that warming comes, that's more energy that's going to fuel intense storms, cause more extreme heat waves, more floods, and more droughts. Unless we are very clear and agree globally that by the middle of this century, we have replaced fossil fuel with wind, solar, hydro, ocean, and other zero carbon forms of energy. I know how hard it is to get the world to change course. There are so many powerful interests. Our politics are short-term, often very corrupt. But what we've learned from big social change, whether it was the fight to end slavery, whether it's women's rights, whether it was the struggle to end colonization, it's a big task and all parts of society have to be engaged. Civil action, absolutely. The divestment campaign, consumer boycotts, litigation against bad behaviors, all crucial. Businesses, especially the ones that are clever, are going to say, the world's going in a different direction. I want to get ahead of the market so that I'm there. So business, very, very important. Government, vital. If we're going to have rule of law, we need government. We need activists in business, activists in government, activists in civil society to be taking the lead and helping all of society to understand this is real. Let's move.
Blah, 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 blah. This is not about some expensive, politically correct green act of bunny hugging or blah, blah, blah. Build back better, blah, blah, blah. Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah. Net zero, blah, blah, blah. Climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action.
More than 100 people, 120 people have died and hundreds more are still missing after the worst flooding in parts of Western Europe for several decades. In Germany, emergency crews are searching for dozens who are unaccounted for, with the Chancellor Angela Merkel describing the floods as a catastrophe. Torrential rain has also devastated parts of Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. Swollen rivers, including the Rhine, the Meuse and the Aar, have swept through towns and villages, destroying homes, leaving many stranded. In Erftstadt, in Germany, whole houses have been submerged and a landslide has demolished parts of the town. Well, many survivors have spoken of the speed at which water levels rose as the rain came down, and tonight some towns and villages remain under threat, with thousands of people in the Netherlands and Belgium urged to leave their homes. Our correspondent Anna Holligan has more details.
Homes engulfed, whole villages submerged, parts of Liège annihilated by the elements. Rescuers are still navigating areas to the west in the town of Pepinster. The military was drafted in to assist the stranded on land and by air. And for some, it's a desperate wait to find out whether their loved ones made it.
My wife is looking for her mother who lives in a town nearby, but we have no means of communication. We don't know where she is or how she's doing.
In nearby Verviers, the waters have receded, but they're still stunned by the extent of the destruction.
Well, some politicians in Germany say the extreme weather is the result of global warming, and they're calling for work on climate protection measures to be accelerated. Our chief environment correspondent, Justin Rolat, assesses the role of climate change in the record amounts of rainfall that are now affecting parts of Europe.
The floods in Germany aren't the only extreme weather event we've seen this summer. There was the dramatic heat wave in Canada and the western United States last month, and Russia, Mexico and New Zealand have all been experiencing unusually high temperatures. Now, the climate science is very clear on this. It has been predicting, not just for years, but for decades, that if we continue to pump huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we will experience increasingly high temperatures. And because warm air holds more moisture, that means heavier rainfall too, and therefore floods.
Well, you only have to look at the pictures of these devastating floods to know that we need to do better. It is not okay for this number of people to die in 2021 from floods.
So the next obvious question is the world doing enough to tackle climate change? Again, the answer is very clear. It is not. The UN says we need to reduce carbon emissions by 7% every year for the next decade if we're going to stand a reasonable chance of staying within what is reckoned to be the safe limit, 1.5 degrees centigrade.
These are the core issues we will be considering during this course. The Code Red climate crisis and its intersect with travel and tourism, particularly the growing impact on the ground through extreme weather. And then we'll also be looking at public reaction to this evolution and development. And that's where the Greta Thunberg generation are so important. In our minds at SunX, much of our focus is on that group who will not only be tomorrow's travelers, but they'll be tomorrow's decision makers as well. And they will be the key people during this period between now and 2050, when we have to get our climate act together. Otherwise, frankly, the future looks very, very bleak. Importantly, Europe is a global center of tourism as an origin and destination. It is, like everywhere, both a victim and a vector for the Code Red climate crisis, and a leader in response. So our action here is both timely and important. It's timely because the climate crisis is here now. It is not just some future possibility. And it's important because if we as a global community don't fix it, our kids and grandchildren will not have a future. We must act now. And we means everyone, from political leaders to the person in the street. The change has to be all-encompassing, because this is a Code Red crisis. Tourism, like other sectors of society, is in the crosshairs. And as Benjamin Franklin famously said, we must hang together or we will all hang separately. So let me start by outlining the course structure. Today, on day one, we'll look at the reality of the climate crisis, its impact on tourism and government and industry actions which are being taken in response, particularly here in Europe. We'll have videos from Professor Danielle Scott in Canada and Suzanne Beckham in New Zealand, who are two of the top tourism and climate academics. And Daniel will hopefully be with us for our discussion. And then we will also consider the government framework which shapes that response, with a focus on the UN climate and sustainability roadmaps. Because it's through the UN that the coordinated global climate action is formulated. And here we'll give special attention to my friend and mentor, the late Maurice Strong, widely acknowledged as the architect of the UN system. And we'll hear from Achim Steiner, UN Under-Secretary General, who worked with Strong in UNEP and other international organizations. And we'll hear something from Strong himself during this session. SUN X, incidentally, stands for the Strong Universal Network, because we're trying to follow Maurice's vision. And the X is for existential, so we will never forget. Day 2 will devote to climate-friendly travel, reviewing the SDGs and their primary intersects with tourism. We'll also look at Paris 1.5 and the UNFCCC processes that impact on that target. On day 3, we'll take a deep dive in Europe, led by our colleague, Jennifer Ude, who's the head of research at ETC. And naturally, we'll be focusing on the EU Fit for 55 programme. We'll also consider issues like EU funding, the importance of cities, and the role of NTOs in climate and sustainability planning. On day 4, we'll turn our attention to the 2 key elements of climate change action: adaptation and mitigation, which we call resilience. How do you live with the intensifying weather extremes? And reduction. How do you lower greenhouse gas to get to zero by 2050? Finally, on day 5, we look at the CFT community more broadly, how we go about building a community framework over time with various stakeholders. And we look at the range of issues that visitors and visitors face from the growth of tourism. We'll review evolving attitudes to green and clean tourism and look at ways to positively engage tourists and residents. What do we hope to achieve? An increase in shared knowledge, shared understanding, and hopefully shared commitment. As Eduardo has said, ETC wants to help its NTO members in the unique destination-specific transformation that each of you will have to make. At SunX Malta, we're very proud to support that goal. We believe our vision of climate-friendly travel, responding to the SDG 2030 framework and Paris 2050 with its 1.5 hard targets can help. By the end of the week, we sincerely hope you'll become part of this vision and part of a committed network of change makers. Let's go to the substance of the matter. Why is climate change the defining issue of our times? Well, essentially, there are 2 reasons. First, it can be the end of life on the planet within a foreseeable timescale for humans and for other species. And it's here right now. That's the second reason. And it's made more acute by what the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, caused the perfect storm of immediate crisis, Ukraine, food shortages, energy security, migration, all of which dominate the political landscape and dangerously crowd out the existential strategic issue of climate response. This is how the IPCC sees this. They say we need an annual reduction of 7.6% in greenhouse gas emissions to get to 1.5. Instead, in the real world, we're growing our emissions. Economically, everyone is in a growth mode, particularly post-COVID. And travel and tourism, with a resurgence of pent-up demand, is in the forefront of this activity. At Cenex Malta, we very much share the IPCC's view. As a charter signatory to the Glasgow Declaration, we did so with the proviso that it does not go far enough, fast enough. And we call for a dash to zero, not a race to net zero. We foresaw a 2030 halving of emissions, and by 2050, zero greenhouse gas. And that's not just carbon. Carbon is 75% of greenhouse gases. The other 25%, predominantly methane, which is 20 to 50 times more impactful than carbon, and sulfur and nitrous compounds, all of which are at least equally dangerous. So let's start now with some really basic issues. What do we mean by climate? Well, we're talking about a long-term atmospheric condition on our planet that governs our shorter-term weather patterns. And with that, the air we breathe, the way we live, the food we eat, the water we drink. For tens of thousands of years, these long-term conditions were stable, allowing the nature and human evolution which our parents knew as children. However, since the Industrial Revolution and fossil fuel power, coal, oil, and gas, just 100 years ago, we've changed that long-term stability in the atmosphere by pumping carbon and other greenhouse gases, which have formed a kind of blanket around the Earth. The heat of the sun has more difficulty to escape, and the planet gets warmer. Polar and mountain ice melts, so sea levels rise and oceans acidify. Weather gets more extreme and unpredictable. Massive storms, rain and heat waves, and air gets more and more polluted. Land heats up, so forests burn and crops wither. This has changed the long-term natural balance, and it continues to do so. As long as greenhouse gas emissions increase, this Earth blanket just gets denser. And it's going to take a long time for it to be reduced, even if we manage to put controls on carbon emissions at levels which the scientists tell us are necessary. So the recent floods in Europe, the heat domes in the US, the hurricanes in the Caribbean, the forest fires in Australia, and melting polar ice sheets are just a milder foretaste of what's to come. And to compound these challenges, the scientists tell us that there are things called tipping points when the Earth's balance reaches a situation that additional pressure creates a major irreversible change. And there are so-called feedback loops, which means that when, for example, polar ice melts, its impact as a cooling mechanism is lost. And that means that the land on which it has been sitting is going to get hotter. And this is a kind of feedback. The ice melts and goes into the sea. The land gets hotter. And the whole process of climate warming intensifies. And these are the challenges that we are facing. And let's just take a moment to remind ourselves just how severe this can get.
It is the general scientific consensus that climate change is causing an increase in extreme weather events around the world.
Oh my God.
From sea level rises to droughts, extreme weather can seriously cripple affected communities. But what is considered an extreme weather event? Extreme weather can be very dramatic, with fire tornadoes, wildfires, severe tropical storms, hurricanes, and cyclones being the prime examples. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an extreme weather event is an occurrence that is more severe than the historical norm. They point out that even statistically, non-extreme weather events can cause significant damage to economies, societies, ecosystems, and infrastructure. As of 2012, there have been more than 800 major extreme weather events recorded worldwide, causing hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. Other sources, like the UK Met Office, show a marked increase in extreme events which caused loss from just over 200 in 1980 to over 700 in 2015. In the US alone, the National Climate Assessment indicates that events like heat waves, heavy downpours, and major hurricanes have noticeably increased in frequency and strength over the last decades. In fact, over the past 30 years, the United States has experienced some of the worst weather events in its history. Take Hurricane Katrina, for example. In August of 2005, the hurricane hit Florida as a Category 1 and evolved into a much more powerful Category 3 along the eastern Louisiana, western Mississippi coastlines. This storm damaged infrastructure and ultimately led to the levee system of New Orleans being overwhelmed. More than 1,800 people lost their lives, and repair costs were estimated to be more than $160 billion. Not to mention the wildfires that ravaged Australia at the beginning of 2020 and the recent fire tornadoes in California. Are these extreme weather events really a consequence of climate change? Or are we just more aware of these events in a world of social media and minute-to-minute reporting? Many experts certainly believe global warming is behind the increasing frequency of these events.
And remember, if this science is to be believed, it can only get worse and worse. I repeat, it can only get worse and worse. The stuff is up there for the foreseeable future, and there is no going back. So now I'm going to come to the heart of this matter and play a couple of videos from the top tourism climate scientists who I've been working on these climate and tourism intersects for the past 15 years. They're both involved with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the global vehicle, which is informing policymakers about measurement and the numbers and the impacts of the actions that they will take in this area. It's an objective science body that provides all the background data for the COP climate negotiations. The videos are from our second SAYS Strong Earth Youth Summit that was just held in April and targeted young people around the world. First, Professor Daniel Scott from the University of Waterloo in Canada. Daniel was the lead author on the 2005 UNWTO report that first measured the carbon footprint of the tourism sector. Principal conclusion of that report was that tourism generates some 10% of global economic activity and produces some 5% of the CO2.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Scott. I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada and also at the University of Surrey in the UK. Jeffrey's asked me to get us started with a little bit of a discussion on how the climate crisis is going to reshape tourism over the next 30 years or so. And in true Jeffrey style, he's given me about 7 minutes to do that. As all of these images show, climate change isn't some future risk for tourism, it's upon us. It's an increasingly important part of our lived experience, whether it be at home or at the destinations that we visit. And you are part of the next generation of travelers, but also tourism leaders that have a massively important role in creating that climate-friendly travel, that climate-friendly tourism economy that we all want to see. First, let me put the climate crisis into a bit of context of what we've been facing now and over the last couple of years. We all know that COVID has been devastating for the tourism sector. Positively, the rebound has begun, and the world of travel is once again bringing us back together. And we have to resist that feeling that, you know, everything that's been wrong for the last little while is going to stay that way. It won't. Defeatism is just as paralyzing to moving forward as is denial. And so the long transformative journey that's required of the climate crisis, you know, it demands us to have a collective resolve to work together towards a vision of a better tourism system that we all know that exists and that we want to work towards. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has released its 6th assessment reports that have come out this year, and the United Nations has declared, you know, climate change code red for humanity, a code red for tourism. And importantly, that this is the decisive decade for climate action as well. And you've all probably seen a figure like this that outlines the various choices that we have and the climate futures that will result from those choices. We have at the top end a red line that is a +3 or warmer world, something we can all agree that we don't want to see happen, but that's the path we're on with emissions today. We have the light blue line in the middle. That's where, if all the pledges from countries to the Paris Climate Agreement were fulfilled, that would take us into that realm. And then we have at the bottom end, the dark blue line. That is that +2 or even a +1.5 world that the Paris Climate Agreement is working towards, that we all want, and we all want to work together. So the question is, what do these different potential futures mean? And importantly, they're all going to transform tourism, but in different ways. And primarily through 2 challenges that I wanted to bring to you today. So the first challenge that we'll face is carbon risk, sorry. How are we going to decarbonize tourism over the next 30 years so that it can have a place in that net zero economy that we all want to see in the 2050s? And the second challenge is climate risk. How do we adapt to the impacts of a changing climate that we're committed to from past emissions? And how at the same time can we foster a more sustainable and more just tourism system at the same time? So let's take a look at those 2 challenges, and we'll start with the world that we want to see and what are the implications of that net zero transition for tourism. And what this figure shows is, first of all, you know, tourism carbon emissions today, which are roughly 5-8% of the global total. It also shows you the trajectory of where our emissions, where we estimate they will be, and how those compare to that net zero pledge that was made by the tourism sector through the Glasgow Declaration. So we have this major gap that we have to address over the next 30 years. And so our question is, you know, how and what are the best ways that we're going to do that? Importantly, there are some real scalable solutions that can make this transformation happen. The International Energy Agency gives us one credible roadmap of key strategies that include efficiency, improving efficiency in hotels, aircraft, the electrification of tour buses and other parts of the tourism system for a clean grid, demand management in some cases, and an important one, sustainable aviation fuels, whether it be through biomass or new synthetic fuels, and modal shifts in some cases, shifting more tourism to electrified buses, to electrified aircraft, and high-speed rail. And we need, you know, real policy, real investment to make this collection of excellent examples that we have here, rather than making them the exceptions. We want these to be the norm. We want these to be mainstreamed over the next decade or so. And we have to do this, you know, not just to decarbonize our operations, but to demonstrate that world leaders, the policymakers on the climate file, that tourism can be part of that net zero economy by mid-century. You know, it won't be easy, it won't be cheap, but we have to look at this as an investment in our social license to be part of that future economy, a carbon constrained economy, and not just, you know, from a cost perspective. Now let's consider the world that we don't want, and that is we might call it a climate disrupted economy. We know that's incompatible with the Sustainable Development Goals. It's incompatible with the kind of sustainable tourism that we want to see. And we don't have time today to go through the wide range of different types of impacts that tourism is seeing and will see increasingly, from weather extremes to sea level rise and even economic or security risks. So instead, let's look at how all of those different kinds of impacts will come together in different parts of the world and what that will mean for tourism around the world. So we can look at a map like this, which is the geography of the combined climate and carbon risk as best as we can estimate it today. It's not perfect, but one of the things that jumps out in front of you when you see this map is how uneven or unfair the impacts that are expected to be in some parts of the world. The highest risk or from climate and carbon risk exists in regions of the world where tourism growth is expected to be the strongest. So climate change will pose a sort of headwind for tourism development in parts of Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America. And even more importantly, when we look at how these impacts, if we look at them through a climate justice lens, we see that, again, some of the biggest impacts are likely to be in the places of the world that rely most on tourism for their economy. And we can't lose sight of this as we develop strategies to adapt and reduce emissions in tourism. We have to keep that climate justice lens in front of us. So with that, bit of context to get us started in our discussion, I want to leave you with two key messages. First, there can be no sustainable tourism or success on the Sustainable Development Goals if we fail on climate. And the second one is, a very wise man reminded us, don't accept that you can't make a difference. What we do as individuals matters. It adds up, especially, and we see that over the last several years, last 3 to 5 years, youth of the world have really found their voice on the climate file. And I encourage you to join those millions that are on the streets and continue to push, what is politically possible, push it closer and closer to what is, we know, scientifically necessary to address the climate crisis. And with that, enjoy the rest of the conference, and I look forward to hearing more from you in the near future. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Now let's hear from Professor Suzanne Becken. Suzanne is also a tourism advisor to the New Zealand Environment Ministry and sits on the advisory board of Air New Zealand.
Hi, my name is Susanna Becken. I'm a professor of sustainable tourism both at Griffith University and the University of Surrey, and I will provide a short summary of what's been happening on climate change and tourism in the last year. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released 2 reports as part of their 6th assessment. One was in August 21, Working Group 1, and the other one was just now in February 22 on the impacts and adaptation. And it just confirms what, of course, we knew, that the path is closing in terms of avoiding climate catastrophe. Only immediate, deep and sustained emission reductions will really avoid substantial warming. If we go with the pledges of countries, we're still heading more for a 3-degree warming and not the 2-degree or even 1.5 that we want to achieve. Now, what's important to know is that even if we fail to deliver on 1.5, every fraction of a degree that we can avoid will save lives, save livelihoods, save species and ecosystems. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now 412 parts per million. That's how you measure. And I remember when it crossed the 400 in 2013, that was a big deal because we never quite thought it would go that much. And in 1900, only sort of 120 years ago, it was 296. So it's going up and it's accelerating despite all the science and the political discussions that we've had for the last 20 or 30 years. So this is the decade of action. In tourism, there's also been a bit of progress. So at the last climate summit in Glasgow, the Glasgow Declaration was launched. It has 400 signatories by now, and basically organizations that subscribe to the pledge commit to deliver reduction plans for carbon and in the order of reducing emissions by half in the next decade and reaching net zero by 2050. The World Travel and Tourism Council also released a net zero roadmap at the summit, and there's a whole bunch of other activities and pledges and roadmaps and tools. So there's been a lot of progress, at least in terms of ambition and awareness. But what matters now is what comes next. And so I will summarize the key issues that I see have emerged in the last 12 months. One is pressure on actual measurement and monitoring of emissions and reductions. So pledges are nice, intentions are good, but we need to reduce absolute reductions, ideally around the science-based targets. Carbon offsetting has lost quite a bit of credibility and currency. It's maybe still nice in terms of a donation to promote basically decarbonization projects, but what really counts is real reductions in their own organization. The second thing that really stands out is aviation. So the last 12 months have seen significant activity by many players in the airline industry, sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen, electric planes, and investments are starting to be made. Qantas announced a $50 million investment into sustainable aviation fuel. And so there's lots of pilots, lots of small scale stuff, still insufficient to make immediate big gains, but at least the ball has started rolling more so than ever. The third thing I would say is the role of government and the public sector and policy making really enabling change. For example, in aviation, in those countries where the industry and government actually work together, like for example, Norway and the Netherlands, that's where the biggest progress is happening. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought the public sector more to the center again for stimulation packages, bailouts, support policy. And this is where the whole notion of building back better has gained traction. Unfortunately, at this point, only 21% of government bailout or support measures are classed as green by the OECD. So in some ways, a missed opportunity of the other 79%. The fourth point that's really important is regenerative tourism, regeneration of ecosystems, nature-based tourism, and really reinvesting in natural capital. And that has also been identified by the IPCC in the most recent report as one of the most important adaptation measures to climate change, is restore the health of the ecosystems. And tourism can play a major role in that. And that leads almost to the final point is around community empowerment, place-based tourism, working with the local stakeholders on sustainable destination management plans that also address issues of social license over tourism, and maybe slower localized tourism that really reduces carbon from supply chains, from improving the circularity of the local economy and so on. So I want to conclude by saying, what can young leaders do? What can you contribute? And I think there's a lot of opportunity. One is young people have new ideas, be creative and innovative, so come up with new business ideas that are really built around this whole transition, social enterprises, innovative solutions, either for technology or for particular people-to-people experience economy opportunities. So there's space to upskill. We all need to build carbon literacy and really deep sustainability understanding, and we need to encourage others and bring others along. Really important is critical thinking. Don't believe everything. Take biofuels as an example. There's a lot of challenges. There's no easy solutions. Sometimes we think we've got a silver bullet, but there's unintended consequences. So we need to be very careful and question everything so we don't dig the hole deeper. Next one is encourage government, go out there or protest or become politically engaged, support the politicians to make the decisions that they need to make. They're very risk adverse. And finally, as for all of us, start with our own behavior, be the change you want to see. We all can make a difference. The more people make a difference, the more it becomes a norm, and it has a domino effect to really achieve what we need to do. So with that, I thank you for having me.
So what, if any, is the common message from these presentations that you might find important in your daily work? There's so much to take on board, but the following seem important to me. One, we need a community-wide action. Two, we need to engage all stakeholders. 3, we must particularly look to the youth. And 4, we must start now, publicly and personally, we must start now. So to round off this introductory section, here's a couple of videos that give us a broader look at the challenge from outside our sector looking in.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I am 16 years old. I come from Sweden, and I want you to panic. I want you to act as if the house was on fire. I have said those words before, and a lot of people has explained why that is a bad idea. A great number of politicians have told me that panic never leads to anything good. And I agree. To panic unless you have to is a terrible idea. But when your house is on fire and you want to keep your house from burning to the ground, then that does require some level of panic. Our civilization is so fragile, it is almost like a castle built in the sand. The facade is so beautiful, but the foundations are far from solid. We have been cutting so many corners. Yesterday, the world watched with despair and enormous sorrow how the Notre Dame burnt in Paris. Some buildings are more than just buildings. But the Notre Dame will be rebuilt. I hope that its foundations are strong. I hope that our foundations are even stronger, but I fear they are not. Around the year 2030, 10 years, 259 days and 10 hours away from now, we will be in a position where we set off an irreversible chain reaction that will most likely lead to the end of our civilization as we know it. That is, unless in that time, permanent and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society have taken place, including a reduction of our CO2 emissions by at least 50%. And please note that these calculations are depending on inventions that have not been yet invented at scale. Inventions that are supposed to clear our atmosphere of astronomical amounts of carbon dioxide. Furthermore, do these calculations not include unforeseen tipping points and feedback loops, like the extremely powerful methane gas escaping from rapidly thawing Arctic permafrost? Nor do they include already locked-in warming hidden by air pollution, nor the aspect of equity or climate justice clearly stated throughout the Paris Agreement, which is absolutely necessary to make it work on a global scale. We must also bear in mind that these are just calculations, estimations. That means that these points of no return may occur a bit sooner or later than that. No one can know for sure. We can, however, be certain that they will occur approximately in these time frames, because these calculations are not opinions or wild guesses. These projections are backed up by scientific facts concluded by all nations through the IPCC. Nearly every major national scientific body around the world unreservedly supports the work and findings of the IPCC. We are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, and the extinction rate is up to 10,000 times faster than what is considered normal, with up to 200 species becoming extinct every single day. Erosion of fertile topsoil, deforestation of our great forests, toxic air pollution, loss of insects and wildlife, the acidification of our oceans. These are all disastrous trends being accelerated by a way of life that we, here in our financially fortunate part of the world, see as our right to simply carry on. But hardly anyone knows about these catastrophes or understand how they are just the first few symptoms of climate ecological breakdown. Because how could they? They have not been told. Or more importantly, they have not been told by the right people and in the right way. Our house is falling apart. And our leaders need to start acting accordingly, because at the moment they are not. If our house was falling apart, our leaders wouldn't go on like you do today. You would change almost every part of your behavior, as you do in an emergency. If our house was falling apart, you wouldn't fly around the world in business class chatting about how the market will solve everything with clever small solutions to specific isolated problems. You wouldn't talk about buying and building your way out of a crisis that has been created by buying and building things. If our house was falling apart, you wouldn't hold 3 emergency Brexit summits and no emergency summit regarding the breakdown of the climate and environmental. You wouldn't be arguing about phasing out coal in 15 or 11 years. If our house was falling apart, you wouldn't be celebrating that one single nation like Ireland may soon divest from fossil fuels. You wouldn't celebrate that Norway has decided to stop drilling for oil outside the scenic resort of Lofoten Islands, but will continue to drill for oil everywhere else for decades. It's 30 years too late for that kinds of celebrations. If our house was falling apart, the media wouldn't be writing about anything else. The ongoing climate and ecological crisis would make up all the headlines. If our house was falling apart, you wouldn't say that you have the situation under control and place the future living conditions for all species in the hands of inventions that are yet to be invented. And you would not spend all your time as a politician arguing about taxes or Brexit. If the walls of our house truly came tumbling down, surely you would set your differences aside and start cooperating. Well, our house is falling apart, and we are rapidly running out of time, and yet basically nothing is happening. Everyone and everything needs to change, so why waste precious time arguing about what and who needs to change first? Everyone and everything has to change, but the bigger your platform, the bigger your responsibility. The bigger your carbon footprint, the bigger your moral duty. When I tell politicians to act now, the most common answer is that they can't do anything drastic because that will be too unpopular among the voters. And they are right, of course, since most people are not even aware of why those changes are required. That is why I keep telling you to unite behind the science. Make the best available science the heart of politics and democracy. The EU elections are coming up soon. And many of us who will be affected the most by this crisis, people like me, are not allowed to vote. Nor are we in a position to shape the decisions of business, politics, engineering, media, education, or science. Because the time it takes for us to educate ourselves to do that simply does no longer exist. And that is why millions of children are taking it to the streets, school striking for the climate to create attention for the climate crisis. You need to listen to us, we who cannot vote. You need to vote for us, for your children and grandchildren. What we are doing now can soon no longer be undone. In this election, you vote for the future living conditions for humankind. And though the politics needed do not exist today, some alternatives are certainly less worse than others. And I have read that some parties do not even want me standing here today because they so desperately do not want to talk about climate breakdown. Our house is falling apart. The future, as well as what we have achieved in the past, is literally in your hands now. But it's still not too late to act. It will take a far-reaching vision. It will take courage. It will take a fierce determination to act now, to lay the foundations where we may not know all the details about how to shape the ceiling. In other words, it will take cathedral thinking. I ask you to please wake up and make the changes required possible. To do your best is no longer good enough. We must all do the seemingly possible. And it's okay if you refuse to listen to me. I am, after all, just a 16-year-old schoolgirl from Sweden. But you cannot ignore the scientists, or the science, or the millions of school striking children who are school striking for the right to a future. I beg you, please do not fail on this.
Now we've defined the scale and nature of the existential climate crisis, let's take a look at the action that is being taken at a global level to respond to it. And to do that, I'm going to take you back 50 years exactly to 1972. And you may have seen some of this in the media recently. The first Earth Summit in Stockholm, and the UN taking ownership of this issue. With my friend and mentor Maurice Strong, the inspiration for SUNEX as the organizer and Secretary General, so focused on the climate danger and the need for urgent action even half a century ago.
It has become apparent that today man's own activities have reached the scale where they are the principal determinants of his own future. For example, we are now today effecting more changes in the composition of the atmosphere, in the composition of the waters of the world, and even the composition of certain elements in our food chain we're making more of these changes in one generation that have been made in millions of years of human evolution. We don't know exactly what will be the ultimate impact of these changes, but we do know that many of them are irreversible, and many of them could be decisive in their effects on man's future. This question is not a matter of one man or one group of people's predictions. It's a matter of the fact that an increasing number of very serious-minded scientists have produced evidence from a whole series of events, many of them the well-known pollution or environmental problems that have come to our attention, that the natural world in which man lives and on which he depends is indeed deteriorating, is being destroyed in many instances at a rate that is accelerating, and that can only continue to accelerate unless we begin to control the activities that are having this destructive impact. Now, whether we are pessimistic or optimistic depends really on what we think about the nature of man. Whether we really believe that man, in light of this evidence, is going to be wise enough and enlightened enough to subject himself to this kind of discipline and control. We can avoid it, I think, first of all, by doing what we're now doing, and that is discussing it, understanding that the problem does exist, that the possibility does exist, and in the actions which I believe still are open to us if we take those actions in time. I'm persuaded that the future of man is going to be decided very much by the decisions taken in this generation.
Dr. Strong, there is a cynical view that any United Nations conference must be a talking shop at which a lot is said and very little is done. How do you answer that?
Well, I can only say that I understand that cynicism. It was one of the things that I had to consider when I took on this responsibility. But it is true. Rhetoric and very little follow-up. And right from the beginning, however, we have been determined, because the fact that action in this field is absolutely indispensable to man's future, that governments at Stockholm would be given the maximum opportunity to take decisions which will lead to action. Now, equally, however, I believe that the nations of the world themselves are impressed with the evidence that we have amassed that suggests that we must adopt a much more cooperative attitude towards our dealing with this problem, that Stockholm must usher in a new era of international cooperation. And I believe that this will be the dominant motivation. I have to hope that. Governments have had a long time to prepare themselves. They've been deeply involved in the preparations. They have before them a series of concrete proposals, which they have had now in their hands for about 3 months. Certainly ample time to consider them. There is no basis for avoiding these decisions at Stockholm. And I believe with that the governments will go to Stockholm with an overriding sense of the importance of achieving consensus on at least a large percentage of these proposals.
And you can see on this slide how this UN-led response has evolved over the past 50 years and is planned to evolve over the next 30 years through to 2050, with a very important waypoint in 2030. So you can see that after Stockholm came UNEP, the environmental center point of the UN, based in Nairobi, with Strong as its first executive director. Then we can see the Brundtland Commission in 1987, which defined sustainability in terms of leaving the earth for our kids in a way that we found it from our parents. Strong's hand can be seen there. He was a member of that commission. And then again, in 1992, the second Earth Summit in Rio, with more than 100 heads of state committing to a bold Agenda 21, a blueprint for the 21st century. And Rio also saw conventions on biodiversity and climate change, with the creation of a dedicated UNFCCC and what I've referred to before, the IPCC. And as if that wasn't enough, in 2000, Strong picked up on what he called the unfinished business from Rio, and teaming up with Mikhail Gorbachev, the former president of the USSR, he created the Earth Charter with 16 principles to create a better framework of coexistence between humanity and the planet. Here is Morris in 2015, at the end of his life, still focused on climate change.
The climate change challenges have to be addressed from the governments, the intergovernmental negotiations, the private sector. All society needs to be involved in addressing climate change. In the intergovernmental negotiations, there is a lot of focus on the technological and financial ways to address the issue of climate change. There's obviously a need for a lot of political will, but what do you think about the ethical dimension needed to address climate change and to come to an international collaboration to address it?
Well, climate change is the biggest single challenge that humans have ever faced, because unlike other problems, which can be solved regionally or sectorally, climate change affects the very future of life on Earth. We have to remember that life as we know it on Earth has only existed for a very small portion of the Earth's history, and within very narrow parameters. And we are changing those parameters. So life is actually in danger. It is the greatest security problem we have ever faced, and we have to treat it. You know, in the past, every nation has been willing to find the resources and give the priorities necessary to deal with their own security. This security issue is one that the whole human family, all nations, all people have to deal with. And we have to look at it as a threat to our very survival. So the Copenhagen negotiations will hopefully bring that home. The scientists have already made that point, but the political level and the economic level have not yet been willing to take the tough decisions that will enable us to ensure the continuity and security of life as we know it.
Unfortunately, many people, particularly in the peaceful arena, I would say, don't see yet climate change as a threat.
Well, more and more of them are. You know, it's actually happening. You know, former Secretary General Kofi Annan just sponsored a report which shows that several hundred million people already being affected by climate change. All sorts of conditions. I mean, even weather. Weather is news today. You have droughts, you have floods, you have changing in rainfall patterns, you have hurricanes, you know, more than before. Now that doesn't say, nobody knows exactly whether they are the cause of climate change, but they are one of the manifestations of climate change, and they demonstrate how climate change can affect people, how it can affect their lives, can even take their lives, and how it can affect their livelihoods. Because now people, for instance, in northern China, the droughts in northern China, people will not support people. They have to move away because, and the same is true in other places. So already we're seeing changes of the kind that the scientists predict, so already we are seeing the kind. And so as people become more and more aware of how their lives are actually being affected by climate change, they will have more incentive to act. However, the problem is they have to act in advance. That is often more difficult for people to see the problem while there is still time to do something. Because if you wait till all the problems are happening, maybe you can do something about them, but you cannot roll them back. It will be too late. And we really face now what no generation of human beings have ever faced. We face the responsibility for our own future. What we do or what we fail to do is going to determine the future of all forms of life, particularly human lives, on our planet. The Earth will continue, but the conditions that humans need to live, that will not continue if we do not change, and change rapidly.
We will see later this week how Maurice Strong's incredible global vision and his passion for local action have been incorporated for tourism in Senex Malta and our plan for our kids. But for the moment, let's listen to some people who worked closely with Maurice during his half-century of work for all of us.
Maurice Strong was born in Oak Lake, a small town in rural Manitoba in April 1929, just before the onset of the Great Depression, which was one of the most profounding shaping forces of his life. I always thought that Maurice was a unique individual, someone who cared deeply about the people, and particularly those who were more vulnerable than others. But in his life, he gained such a unique perspective. He had worked as an oil and businessman in Canada, the United States, and Kenya. He helped establish many non-government organizations and sat on the boards of many other NGOs. He'd interned at the UN as a 17-year-old in the PASS office and helped UN security. He came back at 32 as the UN Under-Secretary General for the first UN conference on the environment held in Stockholm in 1972. The outcome document was shepherded by Maurice, was the first UN negotiated text which mentions climate change. Maurice was ahead of his time in so many areas, climate change being one of the most obvious and relevant to today's conference. An outcome from the 1972 conference was the establishment of the United Nations Environment Programme, of which he would become the first executive director. In 1990, he was asked by the Secretary General of the UN to be the head of the Rio Earth Summit, which would happen 20 years after the Stockholm conference. In his career, he would eventually be appointed by different Secretary Generals 7 times to the post of Under-Secretary General. I wanted to focus on one of his greatest achievements, and that was the shepherding of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. The core text, Agenda 21, a 40-chapter blueprint for how to approach the 21st century. It covered social, economic, and environmental sections, as well as for the first time recognizing 9 stakeholders in society. This included industry and non-government organizations, but it also gave a unique space for young people, for indigenous peoples, and for women. The idea of stakeholder has had a huge impact as a concept, whether it's in the international negotiating processes, or it's at the national level, or at the local, or at the community level. The idea of stakeholders can be traced back to Agenda 21 and to Maurice Strong. The second main outcome was meant to be an Earth Charter, but that didn't happen. But still a very important document was negotiated, the Rio Declaration. 27 principles, such as the polluter pays principle, the principle of prior informed consent, the right to development, common but differentiated responsibility, have found their way into international treaties and also into national law. So played a really important role in the last 30 years or 20 years. The third and the fourth outcomes were the two conventions on biological diversity and climate change, both of which have had vital summits this year. The biodiversity will be in October and the climate in November. What many people do not realize is that in addition to those two conventions agreed at Rio, within 2 years, a third convention on desertification was agreed. And with the additional push from Rio, the conservation and management of straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks was agreed within 3 years of that Rio summit. Finally, the chemicals chapter of Agenda 21 started a process that culminated in the negotiating of 2 additional conventions, one on persistent organic pollutants and the other prior informed consent procedure for hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade. 6 new international regulations came out of the Rio conference, a huge impact. Last week's Biden climate summit was very important. Morris recognized that the economy and business are not separate from the environment. He would have been very happy, not just with the increased national contributions by the United States and other countries, but the emergence of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, 160 firms together responsible for assets in excess of 70 trillion. The market is changing and it's lining up to address climate change and help us deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. And this will have huge impacts as we move forward. Finally, I had the pleasure of working on what would be Morris's final contribution to a book, Only One Earth, which takes the reader from the 1960s to the Rio +20 summit in 2012. Underlying this book and the work of Morris and his unique network of stakeholders is the recognition that thinking globally and acting locally isn't enough. We need to think and act at all levels and in all aspects of our lives if we are going to live sustainably on this only one earth. Thank you very much.
Maurice was a friend and mentor to many of us. He was also a true leader and trailblazer for the environment. Indeed, Maurice's work gave birth to a brand new era of international environmental diplomacy and governance at the 1972 Stockholm Conference, which saw the birth of the United Nations Environment Programme. It was the first UN agency to be headquartered in a developing country, and it was Maurice who built up UNEP from the ground with its headquarters in Nairobi on what was then a very simple coffee farm on the outskirts of the capital city of Kenya. Maurice convened the first ever international expert group meeting on climate change, a clear demonstration of how he was way ahead of the curve. He shepherded in a range of vital global environmental governance processes from the original Rio Earth Summit, Agenda 21 and the Rio Declaration to the launch of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Crucially, Maurice ensured the full participation of developing countries in these processes that included listening closely to those who were feeling marginalized, as well as indigenous people and those who were the poor in the world. He was also a champion of nature-based solutions. He always saw the human species as part of the greater natural whole. He always identified the incredible capacity of nature to provide answers that even the most sophisticated technology and science still cannot match to this day. It is also very welcome to see that leaders of the travel and tourism industry are getting behind the SunX initiative and are committing to climate-friendly travel, helping us to meet our climate goals. This is a step that I believe Maurice Strong would have welcomed. Maurice will be forever remembered for placing the environment on top of the international agenda at the heart of development, with people and the planet being an integral part of that agenda. His courage, his entrepreneurship, his brilliance will continue to inspire me personally, and I know many generations to come. It is on his legacy that many of us are building today, with the hope that we can address the great challenges of the 21st century with the pioneering work that he was so much part of. To all of you and to all of us, thank you for being part of this continuing effort. At the 2014 UN General Assembly, Maurice Strong called on world leaders to rise to their historic responsibility as custodians of the planet and I quote, to take decisions that will unite rich and poor, north, south, east and west in a new global partnership to ensure our common future.